Hello, and welcome to another episode of Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. This podcast is a production of bber, the recognized expert in socioeconomic data for the state of New Mexico. I'm your host, Rayanne McKernan, but today we're going to do things a little differently. I'm not sure if you are aware, but one of bber's services is an economic forecast that we call FOR-UNM. We do FOR-UNM forecasts every quarter, and our most recent one came out in the beginning of May. These forecasts have been a production of bber for over 30 years, and this service provides information and analysis of economic trends that businesses and government leaders in the land of enchantment need to identify opportunities, evaluate performances, and develop budgets. For instance, the state government uses our forecast for revenue projections when setting the state budget. The forecast is also used by public and private organizations. We do a national forecast, we do a state forecast, we also break out into the major metropolitan areas of Albuquerque, Farmington, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, and the Permian Basin, which is Lea Eddy County. If you would like more information on our forecasting services, please visit our website at bber, that's bber.unm.edu. But without further ado, let's get into listening to what Jeff, our director, has to say. He's going to be giving you just a small snippet of what our forum subscribers get. And this is what he told them a few weeks ago about the New Mexico state economic outlook.
We feel that the Global Insight, or I guess now IHS market forecast was surprisingly optimistic. They had what we would call V-shaped recession and recovery, where we saw almost the same number of jobs by end 21, more by 22 than we had in 19. Essentially, when we look at the forecast, it comes down to, as much as anything else, a question of epidemiology. And I have to say that after listening to Dr. Cruces' presentation this morning, I'm more convinced, far more convinced, that this V-shaped recovery may be missing the point. Essentially, what is suggested in a V-shaped recovery is that we are looking at, and so essentially what a forecast is likely to look like is what you might expect in terms of the response to COVID-19. The V-shaped one option is a single wave ending, and these are actually written out by Global Insight as a single wave of transmission that ends in early summer. They're actually saying in May or early June. A quick return to work. We're talking about by the beginning of the third quarter, and a very quick recovery thereafter. A second model is limited activity over the summer. The recession persists, and it is quite deeper than under the first scenario. And recovery is a bit lagged, a couple years, but eventually in that 2-year period, you recover to pre-employment levels. A third model is an L-shaped recession and recovery. Essentially, the idea here is that the struggle continues. We might see more than a single wave of infection. The gating is significant. The point being that prolonged shutdown wipes out savings of households and businesses unable to access capital. The consequence is that we actually lose businesses. It's not just a matter of shutting down and then reopening, but we're losing businesses. The consequence of which is that recovery is long and slow and incomplete. For very different reasons, this scenario, the L-shaped recovery looks very much like New Mexico's experience with the Great Recession. We, as Mo has mentioned, this time provide 4 scenarios of baseline, the optimistic and pessimistic, but as we'll talk about, we also have a, we can call it a worst case scenario, which looks more like the L, but generally our scenarios tend rather from the V as seen in the IHS forecast, more of a U. Our expectation is that we will see the loss of 73,000 jobs, or nearly 9% of the workforce in the current quarter. Of course, average over the quarter. So there may be points in which, for example, right now, which is greater, some people will go back to work perhaps, but the average during the quarter will be down 73,000. And we see, and here's the U versus the V, and these are quarter over quarter numbers. Usually we talk in terms of year over year, but in this particular case, looking at sort of quarter over quarter gives you a better sense of the dynamics of what we're looking at. That in the third quarter, we see an additional loss of nearly 9,000 jobs, or 1% altogether. We're down then about 10% by the end of the third quarter. We then gain back about 18,000 jobs, 2.4% in the fourth quarter. Note that, again, these are quarter over quarter, but typically we would see anyway significant increased employment in the fourth quarter. So if you look at these on year-to-year basis, the fourth quarter remains well below what we've seen in the past. In general, on an average basis, all 12 months, which would also then include January and February, when things were reasonably strong, we're looking at a loss of about 52,000 jobs, or 6.4% below what we had in 2019. In our baseline scenario, recovery gains some steam in the second half of 21, but only in the second half. So if you look at 21 over 20, you actually see negative numbers, but picks up pace through 20, and then at 22, and then slows to trend about 1.5% or so for 23, 4, and 5. In this scenario, we end the forecast period to 2025 with slightly fewer jobs than we had in 2019. This again is our baseline scenario, and slightly is about 4,000 jobs, or 0.5% over a 5-year period. Just for comparison, the losses in the Great Recession were far less severe, and it took us more than 10 years to get back to get whole. Here we're looking at somewhere short of 5 years in the baseline scenario. As Mo's pointed out, personal incomes hold up significantly better as the personal transfers to households and included in the CARES Act have significant benefits to New Mexican households. I want to talk for a second and take a step back and look at the big picture. What are New Mexico's relative advantages and disadvantages compared to other states in dealing with this recession and a recovery? And again, I think the context that I want to put here is the big picture is this. The longer this goes, the greater the strain on savings and capital, both for households and for businesses. And recovery is unlikely to return us to something that we looked at before. In just the last 6 weeks, I know I have sort of picked up new patterns, new habits, and many of them I like, and I may hold on to, even if the world was to return exactly to what it was at the end of last year. Those different patterns, habits, consumer preferences are likely to be carried forward, and so what we will see in the future is not what we will see in the past, but will be something else. So things like retail, for example, may look very different or much smaller than what we saw in the past. Another element of this, and this context before I get into these details, is that we are going to see innovation and change, which of course does not benefit everybody equally. There will be winners and there will be losers as a result of this. And winners and losers can be understood in terms of individuals and classes, but it is also the case in terms of geography. Some places will fare reasonably well, others not as well. Looking specifically now at the advantages, one significant advantage that I've already touched on that New Mexico has is that we are well supported by federal dollars, and in general, we have the third highest percentage of our workforce works for government agencies. We're in the top 5 or so in terms of per capita receipt of federal dollars, and that includes both contracts, for example, the national labs and the dollars that flow from those, but also transfers to households, which include, yes, unemployment, Medicaid, but also Social Security, etc. So there are many of those. Second, we have, though we've not always been able to exploit them, strong technology centers, including the national labs, the universities, etc. These are likely to play an important part in the innovation that will take us out of the recession. And third, perhaps most controversially, we have reserves that will help cushion the blow in fiscal 21, although not certainly entirely. The other one I think is I feel responsible to put it in there. The fact of the matter is that we have more than $20 billion in permanent funds that, of course, constitutionally are off limits, but they are there. And in worst case scenarios, that may be an issue. Disadvantages are many. Most importantly, households have limited assets, limited savings. They're going to run dry much quicker than obviously a household with better savings or average households in other states. Likewise, we are very dependent on small businesses, far more so than in other states. 51% of New Mexico's workforce works for businesses, I should get this number right, of 100 employees or less. So it's actually establishments of 100 or fewer, which is one of the highest percentages in the country. So we are highly dependent on small businesses, and these small businesses typically have limited savings and have limited access to capital. We also have a weak financial sector, which is to say that makes it very difficult for businesses to access capital. This has become manifest currently, although we don't have good data on this yet, in the payroll protection plan, in that, as we've of course heard, it seems as though relatively few larger companies are gaining access to this now, I think it's over $600 billion in financial assistance. Primarily because the ones who seem to be getting in the front of the line are the people who have, or the businesses that have close relationships with typically larger financial institutions, as the federal government's using those larger institutions that channel the dollars, and that does not tend to be the case in Mexico. We have relatively few of those larger financial institutions, and businesses have relatively limited access to it. Conversely, we are more dependent on smaller businesses. There are some provisions in the last payroll protection, the second round, to allocate some monies to smaller community banks, but it remains a relatively small fraction of the entire of the whole. A fourth disadvantage is that more than most other states, we are dependent on customer service industries, leisure and hospitality, for example. These are industries, of course, that are most directly impacted by shutdown measures and by the transmission of the coronavirus. Finally, during, as is characteristic, you see a recession, recoveries often involve consolidation. Companies that come out of the recession with more capital are better able to secure their market shares. We've seen this in the past, and we are likely to see this in the future. What this means is that it is possible, if a disadvantage or a risk that we face is that there will be market consolidation that will directly affect Mexico's businesses. Oftentimes when we see these consolidations, we see a couple things. One is that the profits of them don't stick around, and two, they tend to be labor much better, more labor efficient, and so that will not necessarily bode well to employment. So this is just for context what we perceive as being the relative advantages and disadvantages that New Mexico faces in dealing with the COVID crisis and recovery, the economic impact of the crisis and recovery. Just very briefly, I want to just go back and steal Mo's slide. On the left, I just want to emphasize this one. We see a baseline scenario, which is almost like a perfect V. The optimistic scenario, which hardly looks any different, just a little bit less deep. And the pessimistic scenario, interestingly, is just a very, very deep V, but a very, very deep recovery. And what you'll actually see, looking on the right, is that by the end of time, 2025, the gap between the pessimistic scenario is significantly reduced. That is to say that the rate of growth post-21 or post-20 in the pessimistic scenario exceeds that of the baseline and the pessimistic for that matter. So these we consider to be, even though, the point being, even their worst case scenario seems potentially quite optimistic. I'm just going to give away the answers before we go through the rest of the book here. These are the four scenarios that we're putting forth. The first three scenarios, which are the optimistic, baseline, and pessimistic, essentially are functionally no different than what we do in the past, which is we work primarily on the baseline scenario, and then we just run IHS's optimistic and pessimistic scenarios through those models, and they come up. So in other words, our baseline looks different than theirs, but our pessimistic looks similarly different. The second pessimistic or worst case scenario, as you can see, is significantly worse. It is the L-shaped recovery. It is what we believe to be, felt some responsibility to provide what may be a worst case scenario just for contingency planning. We'll talk more about these in detail. Here is our outlook for employment. Of course, what we are seeing here, as we've described, these are year-over-year numbers, and so we see a very sharp 8.5% decline in the second. This is actually the second quarter. Even deeper decline, i.e., further losses in the third quarter, and some modest quarter-over-quarter increases, which is to say year-over-year, the declines are somewhat more moderated. On the other hand, we do not see the spike of employment thereafter. It's somewhat longer, but more subdued compared to the baseline, which was in January. Of course, we did not anticipate this tremendous decline of these four periods, but growth is above that trend, but again, not sufficient to recapture what we've seen and lost in the past. And in the out years, the trend is, the long-term trend is essentially back to what we were perceiving before. Looking at this by sector, and this is where we'll dig a bit more into some of those other ideas. This is just 2020. Of course, what we see is a tremendous decline in retail and accommodation, as well as administrative services, which include temporary employment services, which obviously may be the first to go. Even in percentage terms, these are significant declines, 15-20%. When we return from 20 and 20 to 21, what I think is most significant here is that what we do not see is retail rebounding. This is a significant difference from what you actually see in Global Insight if you start looking at the data on a sector by sector basis. Part of the recovery and the strength of the recovery, that V, is that these retail jobs bounce back. so to bounce back the accommodations and food services. We do not anticipate the same. In effect, the U-shaped versus the V-shaped scenarios, a key difference is regards retail trade and the strength of recovery in accommodations and food services. You will see that the three branches of government essentially remain flat over this period of time. Looking at personal income, the scenario is significantly less severe. In 2020, the declines are actually quite minimal. You actually in Q2 and Q3 see positive growth, and as we will see, this is entirely due to the increase in transfer payments, which more than offset cuts in or losses in wage and disbursements to employees. The decline, actually the delayed decline in personal income losses in 21 are effectively the rollback of those initial transfer programs, which are not offset by a commensurate increase in employment. Here's the employment looking out. This is actually looking into the forecast. These red bars, the red parts of the bars, are transfer payments. As you can see here, we are looking at a tremendous increase in transfer payments. The reason we have positive numbers is that these transfers more than offset wage and salaries. And to put this in context, we are looking at, by our estimates, and it's charted out in the report in some detail, in the area of $5 to $6 billion of increased transfer payments to New Mexico over this 2-quarter period, which more than offsets all other losses. Moving ahead into 21, these negative numbers are simply the disappearance. In effect, these are year-over-year numbers, and so insofar as these transfers don't continue, we see a year-over-year decline in the transfers. We see a gradual increase in wage and salary, particularly private wage and salary disbursements, and as well as other labor income. Turning to the alternative scenarios, I think I've already touched on this. I think it goes without saying that the degree of uncertainty that we're facing here is completely unprecedented. This is not to pretend that this is an exercise in economics is foolish. This is as much sort of looking in a crystal ball of epidemiology and trying to guess what is going to happen with this disease. And so essentially what we've tried to do in these alternative forecasts are look at what four different possibilities for the course of the disease, as much as what the economic responses to those are. Global Insights, as I've noted, share a V-shape. New Mexico's forecasts are less optimistic, tend towards a U-shape. We offer, I've noted, a baseline and two standard alternatives, the optimistic and the pessimistic, but we've added a second pessimistic, which is intended to chart a worst-case scenario or floor, if you will, under the outlook. The pessimistic scenarios are essentially defined, yes, by the trend in the disease and the sustained layoffs, but also the challenges that I've defined above. That is limited access to capital among small businesses, a concern for the trend of business consolidation, and likely budget cuts, government budget cuts. Finally, as I've already mentioned, the second scenario is very much an L-shaped recovery, or perhaps even non-recovery, where we fall far short of previous employment numbers by an end forecast period. I've already shown this again. You see that Global Insight, we've shown this many times, is sharply V-shaped with, in pessimistic, a dramatic increase in recovery in 21. These, as I've already pointed out, and giving away the answers, are our forecasts. The black line is the baseline forecast. It is exactly what we have shown above. What you can note here, as Mo had already mentioned, even in the Global Insight account, the optimistic scenario, the green line, really is hardly better. It is slightly less of a decline in the short term, and slightly slower recovery in the midterm. Therefore, you end up with, in New Mexico, 8,000 or so, less than 1% more jobs than under the baseline. The pessimistic scenario is, again, informed by Global Insight's input numbers, which are, again, a U-shape. We see a much deeper, as in the Global Insight model, pessimistic and much deeper decline in 2020, where we are seeing, I think, as much as 120,000 jobs lost in the second and third quarters. The problem sustains for a while. This, again, it reflects some of the epidemiology, and recovery is significantly more robust, or that is to say, the rate of growth is stronger than the baseline. Simply put, you have more jobs lost, lower lying fruit to add and grow. But in this case, you end up in this scenario with only about 10,000 fewer jobs than in the baseline, about 1%. The third is, to be really honest, not a modeling exercise. It essentially borrows from the other scenarios. Specifically, what we have done to sort of give you the technical account is pessimistic 2 shares the worst or the most negative aspects of the baseline and the pessimistic 1 scenario. That is, as you see in the initial phase, the pessimistic 2 is exactly the same as the pessimistic 1. The difference are twofold. One is the growth rate, the slope of that line thereafter follows that of the baseline, rather than the quicker recovery of the pessimistic. Further, what is also the case here is that we have lowered the oil prices, and oil production and mining employment in this scenario, essentially reflecting a scenario in which global economic recovery is weaker than in the baseline scenario, thus impacting New Mexico through those channels. In this case, this is the income scenario. It was pointed out quite interestingly that if you look at the global the economic scenario, you see that the L1 baseline pessimistic scenario recovers quite quickly. Here, what you actually see is that the income does not follow that trend. Rather, almost follows, ends up closer to the pessimistic 2 than the baseline. There's a reason for this, and it reflects some of the points I made before. Essentially, what happens in even the pessimistic scenario in Global Insight is that you see a tremendous cut in retail and leisure and hospitality, other relatively low-wage sectors, but also in equally rapid growth. Much of the recovery in the pessimistic scenario here is actually a gain in low-wage jobs. Consequence is that when you translate this into income growth, is that you see growth of low-income jobs. Therefore, the growth of income does not track the growth of employment. And thus, in New Mexico in particular, this scenario, the pessimistic scenario from the income point of view, actually looks significantly worse than the employment scenario. These for the record, are global insights. The first three are global insights, alternative scenarios for WTI prices. The black line, the baseline, what you will see is that they end up somewhere just south of $70 per barrel. The optimistic scenario, they end up at slightly more than $80 a barrel. What's very interesting is because of the pace of the recovery in the pessimistic, again, the pessimistic simply falls further. Employment and global economic activity recovers more rapidly. What's interesting here is that in the pessimistic scenario, oil prices actually climb much more quickly, and by the end of the forecast period, 2025, arrive at just under $100 per barrel. The red line is our modification of, again, the baseline forecast for oil prices, and thus oil production. That is what we have for New Mexico.
Well, that wraps it up for us here at Enchanting Economics in New Mexico. Don't forget to check us out at bber, that's bber.unm.edu, or on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn under @UNMBeber. Thanks for listening, and remember, as one of the first governors of New Mexico said, all calculations based on experience elsewhere fail in New Mexico. Take care.